Sometimes, a child's final day reveals the darkest side of a society. The sun rose slowly, ushering in what seemed like an ordinary day, but was in fact the beginning of an inevitable end. A mild breeze drifted through the quiet streets of Palmdale, a neighborhood reminiscent of the warmer climate in Los Angeles. The first rays of light, peeking through the narrow spaces between buildings, gradually brightened a neighborhood still wrapped in slumber. To any outside observer, this morning might have seemed ordinary, but for Gabriel Fernandez, it would mark the start of his final day. Time would seem to slow for him, even as the sharp edge of fate drew nearer just as swiftly. Inside his home, the air was laden with tension, a palpable unease that clung to the walls, refusing to disperse even in the face of a new day. Although from the outside it might have looked like a typical family life, the reality behind the closed door was entirely different for the young boy. Hidden beneath this veneer of normalcy, fear, and the remnants of past injuries were clear reflections of Gabriel's lived experiences. It was obvious from the various bruises on his body that his morning ritual was far from that of a normal child. The early hours of the day were slowly approaching. Sunlight began to filter into the small bedroom, illuminating the pale blankets under which Gabriel stirred. In a normal world, children his age would be waking up excited about school, thinking about lunchboxes, or the fun they might have at recess. But the haunted look on Gabriel's face told a different story. He greeted each new day with dread, uncertain when the cloud of ongoing terror would erupt again. Observers reported that in his final healthy sightings, Gabriel's body bore numerous wounds and bruises, raising flags with social services and school officials. Despite inquiries, this particular morning offered no refuge for him. Indeed, the end he would face was likely closer than anyone realized. Looking around the apartment, it was possible to see hastily arranged furniture and a few scattered items. Colorless curtains let in just enough of the morning sun, as though unwillingly illuminating the silence that pervaded these rooms. This cluttered environment seemed to echo the boy's internal chaos. His quiet demeanor matched the heavy tension in the air. Perhaps he had dreamed of a normal childhood moment that night. Yet the reality of his body's pain and the looming threat around him instantly brought him back as he opened his eyes. Facts indicate Gabriel had multiple prior reports of abuse, with both neighbors and teachers suspecting ill treatment. Yet no one had saved him. It was impossible to imagine a carefree child's laughter or typical morning chatter in that home. Instead, what awaited him, day after day, was an ever-present fear of what new horrors might come his way. Had a stranger observed him as he woke, they might have noticed how his breathing was shallow and how he scarcely moved. They would have seen, in the tense curve of his forehead, that pain was never far. Though he was only 8, he carried himself with a certain resignation, an instinct to survive even in the face of relentless brutality. His small hands may have gripped the thin blanket, holding on tight as if it were a fragile lifeline to the world. But there was no question that this morning was brimming with a dreadful silence, one that held little hope for escape. Eventually, there was some slight movement in the house. The timid glow of daylight emphasized the exhaustion on Gabriel's face. The typical hustle and bustle of breakfast did not exist. No cereals, no fruit juice, not even the simple exchange of a good morning. Should an unknowing observer peek inside, they might find the scene tragically ordinary, just a child in a cluttered living space. But a more careful look would immediately expose the simmering darkness in that room, reflected in Gabriel's eyes. Footsteps resonating from the hallway or the gentle cooing of morning birds outside only served to highlight the weight of the silence and the boy's growing despair. In those early morning hours, a sense of unease was distinctly perceptible. The boy's slight frame bore injuries that foretold how fragile his life had become. The yawning silence was broken only by the rustling of a worn blanket or the echo of the occasional door closing in the corridor beyond. In many homes, sunrise symbolizes the start of a day filled with excitement, learning, and possibilities. But for Gabriel Fernandez, Those first rays of sunshine highlighted only the beginning of a dark path. Fear clung to him, an unwelcome companion in a story nearing its final act. The morning light that gently warmed the neighborhood brought him no solace, but instead amplified the icy tension. This was the dawn of Gabriel's last day, a day that would end in irreversible tragedy. Time kept moving, yet destiny was already sealed. As daylight steadily brightened Palmdale streets, cars began trickling onto the roads, and people headed off to work. Laughter, rushing feet, and the excitement of children on their way to school brought a kind of life to the neighborhood that morning. Yet behind the door of the apartment where Gabriel Fernandez lived, the atmosphere could not have been more different. Each time the front door opened and closed, a heavy sense of dread remained trapped inside. Gabriel's daily routine was practically non-existent. It was next to impossible for him to leave his home and go out to play like a normal child, or show up at school and enjoy time with classmates. His home had long ceased to be a safe haven, instead becoming the epicenter of his terror. Existing records indicate he frequently missed school and had been observed by teachers showing multiple injuries. Yet on this final day, it appears there were no attempts to conceal anything from outsiders. Gabriel stayed within the suffocating walls of that apartment. As midday approached, tension inside the house reached a new level. From the outside, it may have appeared eerily quiet. Within, the constant weight of hostility and fear would have made it hard for Gabriel to breathe. The boy, only 8 years old, had no independence to seek help. Any cry for help he might have tried to make would likely have gone unnoticed. The world on the other side of that door continued in its normal rhythm, one in which children played freely and grown-ups ran errands. Gabriel, however, experienced nothing resembling normal life. There is minimal verified information about who he may have spoken to on that last day. It's likely he neither saw his school friends nor communicated with his teachers or extended family. Despite repeated warnings about his injuries, nothing had changed for him. The state of his health had visibly deteriorated. Breathing in the stale air of his apartment, Gabriel must have realized that no one was coming to save him. Even so, life in the surrounding neighborhood went on as usual. Perhaps a passing neighbor might have noticed faint sounds inside the apartment or glimpsed fleeting movements behind the partially drawn curtains. But no one truly understood the gravity of his plight. In many cases, people focus on the physical signs of violence, forgetting how deeply emotional and psychological abuse can cut. Had Gabriel somehow been able to reach out, maybe by pressing his ear against the door or looking out a window, he might have witnessed the mundane routines of others. Maybe someone was walking their dog or heading back from the grocery store. But none of that ease extended to him, captive in a house that offered him no sanctuary. At that hour, most calls or messages that might have provided a glimmer of hope did not occur. Police statements and investigation records later showed no sign of a doctor's visit or medical attention on that day. No pleas for help from this child. An 8-year-old was utterly reliant on the adults around him, who failed him. By early afternoon, the oppressive routine that engulfed Gabriel hinted at a world moving relentlessly on without him. His small tasks, like taking a few steps within the apartment or fleetingly peeking out the window, were overshadowed by a grim sense that the day was leading to something far worse. The bright Californian sun glared at the walls, but that light did nothing to lift the gloom cast over the boy's living space. Every minute that passed was a silent countdown. Even from a purely observational viewpoint, one could sense that the child was caught in a hopeless cycle. Perhaps he had small toys or objects that offered temporary distraction. Perhaps the hum of a distant TV or the echoing chatter from adjacent apartments broke the quiet. But none of it dispelled his terror. Each noise, whether a creaking door or footsteps nearing his room, caused his heart to race. Neither the warmth of the sun nor the passage of time delivered any comfort. They only intensified the darkness that clung to him. Thus, the events of that day unfolded like a hushed forewarning. Behind the mundanity of everyday life, a silent storm was brewing, and Gabriel was trapped at its center. The slow hours of daylight would soon yield to a dusk that brought with it no promise of rest. Instead, Each passing moment only underscored that his destiny was already sealed. Strangely, life outside moved on, seemingly oblivious to the tragedy about to conclude within those four walls. As the hours passed, shadows lengthened and darkness drew near. Toward late afternoon, the sun began tilting toward the horizon, casting sharper shadows against Palmdale's apartment complexes. The air cooled a bit, and children playing outside started to return home for dinner, while local shops and markets prepared for the evening rush. To a casual onlooker, life would seem to proceed in its regular routine. But for Gabriel Fernandez, these final hours would be anything but ordinary. Time was slipping away, and each moment weighed heavily on the child. Security camera footage, an essential element in the later court proceedings, showed few signs of Gabriel outside his home that day. In fact, it confirmed he barely stepped out, if at all. Neighbors familiar with the case admitted they rarely saw him, sometimes forgetting a child even lived there. That last day, the door to Gabriel's apartment seemingly stayed shut. As the afternoon wore on, the tension inside the unit became increasingly suffocating. With the dimming daylight filtering through the curtains, the cramped living space took on an even more claustrophobic air. While families elsewhere hurried to set the dinner table and gather together, Gabriel faced the same oppressive atmosphere he'd endured since morning. His face, etched with constant anxiety, reflected both physical pain and the mental toll exacted by his environment. An external perspective might still reveal an ordinary bustle in the apartment building corridor. Neighbors coming home, conversations drifting up the stairwells, people carrying groceries to their doors. Yet Gabriel's interactions with anyone outside were likely non-existent. The day's final glimpses, if there were any from security cameras, showed no visit from extended family or friends. If any neighbor caught a fleeting sound or had a moment's curiosity, they did not act on it. Evening, a time typically signifying warmth and familial comfort, brought no solace. As twilight approached, every object within Gabriel's line of sight, furniture, walls, even the narrow hallway, seemed ominous. Fear can magnify mundane details, and for a child in perpetual distress, the closing hours of daylight could seem profoundly unsettling. With each passing minute, the suspense grew heavier, as if the darkness itself heralded an impending calamity. Some neighbors provided statements suggesting they heard muffled noises coming from that apartment in the late afternoon and early evening. They heard thuds and perhaps muffled yelling, but no one was certain of the source or severity. In hindsight, this was a harrowing omen. Gabriel likely sensed a shift in the air, anticipating further escalation of the cruelty he'd endured. A quickening pulse, a tightening in his chest. These were the hints of fear stoked by approaching footsteps or a raised voice. Beyond the apartment, the world went on with its evening routine. Cars pulled into parking spots, dogs barked in neighboring yards, streetlights flickered on against a slowly darkening sky. But for Gabriel, every passing sound from outside was a tragic reminder of life continuing as normal, far from his reality. Nightfall only sharpened the edges of his despair. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the hush that descended upon the building was broken only by occasional rattles from the hallway or the distant hum of a television. For someone in Gabriel's position, these small noises could be harbingers of what lay ahead. Every hour, every minute, brought him closer to an unspeakable fate. If a passerby paused at the apartment door, they might have felt something unsettling, yet intangible, a chill that suggested all was not well within. But daily life, with its myriad distractions, often deafens us to distant cries for help. He was running out of time. The final steps of his last day carried him inexorably toward a darkness more profound than mere nightfall. Like the lengthening shadows on the walls, fear began to loom larger in that small apartment, preluding a heartbreaking outcome. There was no respite for Gabriel, no shift in his precarious reality. As the clock ticked steadily toward evening, it seemed the cords of fate had already snapped. Any faint hope of rescue faded into the encroaching darkness. And then it happened. The strands of destiny were severed. Night fell over Palmdale, and one by one, the streetlights flickered on, illuminating roads where cars cruised by, and people returned from a day's work. From outside, it seemed like any other evening, with families winding down for the night. Yet in Gabriel Fernandez's apartment, events had progressed to a point of no return. The phrase "fatal blows of fate" resonates here, not from an actual bullet, but from the relentless abuse and neglect that would claim his life. Official reports show that the final onslaught of violence inflicted on Gabriel that evening caused severe injuries, documented in later autopsies and examinations. They detail broken ribs, head trauma, burns, and internal bleeding. Still, the horror of those moments is best captured in the brutal truth that these injuries were inflicted on a defenseless child behind the walls of a seemingly ordinary apartment. Some neighbors recalled hearing loud noises and disturbing crashes, but they did not fully grasp the gravity of what transpired. While the world outside gradually slipped into its usual nocturnal quiet, inside that apartment, Gabriel's reality grew more catastrophic. Any flicker of hope that he might cling to vanished amid the overwhelming pain. His small frame could not sustain the intensity of the assault any longer. In the ensuing days, police reports and forensic analyses would paint a tragic portrait. The sum of these injuries was fatal. Close to midnight, as the final horrors unfolded, an emergency call was eventually placed. However, the question of how late the call was made would become a point of heated debate during investigations. When paramedics arrived, they were confronted with a harrowing scene. Gabriel's body bore clear signs of prolonged abuse that went far beyond anything explainable by a normal household accident. The sight deeply affected even the most seasoned first responders. The corridors filled with echoes of frantic activity, and neighbors crept halfway out their doors, trying to glimpse what was happening. Flashing red and blue lights reflected on the building's facade, amplifying the sense of dread. The paramedics rushed Gabriel to an ambulance, attempting life-saving procedures. A subdued chaos reigned, as onlookers whispered grim speculations. But for Gabriel, the end was already near. During those final minutes, his small body reached a point where resuscitation efforts were virtually in vain. A child's fragile bones and battered organs could not endure so much trauma. Witness statements would later reveal the heartbreak and disbelief among responding medics, who understood that hope had likely slipped away. Even as they fought to save him, the relentless damage was too extensive. The phrase "fatal blows of fate" here serves as a metaphor. No bullet was fired, yet a far more devastating and cruel force ended his life. This force was composed of indifference, hatred, and repeated violence, bearing down mercilessly on a young child. The sorrowful truth of that night, etched in the official records, told how an innocent life reached its final moments under the worst possible circumstances. Within minutes, flashing police lights encompassed the entire street as officers closed off the area. The building itself seemed haunted by the echoes of the tragedy it had concealed. Meanwhile, paramedics continued their desperate attempts, pumping oxygen and administering CPR. Yet the damage had been done. Vital organs, including his brain, were likely past the point of recovery. The man-made darkness that consumed Gabriel overshadowed any glimmer of protection society was supposed to provide. And so, that decisive moment arrived, severing Gabriel Fernandez's ties to this life. In a matter of hours, a child was transformed into another statistic of systemic failure, a scarring testament to our collective responsibility. The next day would see the start of crime scene investigations, media coverage, and public outrage. But for Gabriel, time had already run out. A legend had fallen, and the world was stunned. News of Gabriel Fernandez's death spread quickly from local outlets to national news sources. At first, the idea that an 8-year-old child had been subjected to such extreme violence was almost inconceivable. But headlines like "8-year-old boy abused in Palmdale" soon became a fixture in newspapers, television broadcasts, and online platforms, sparking widespread outcry. People everywhere struggled to comprehend how this could have happened, and why social services and law enforcement had not intervened to protect the child. The immediate response from the media followed a predictable pattern of breaking news coverage. Helicopter shots circled overhead, capturing footage of the crime scene, while correspondents filmed live updates. From a voiceover perspective, the most heart-wrenching aspect of these scenes was that at the center of it all was a child who had lost his life. Journalists crowded around the apartment building, illuminating it with camera lights as bystanders and neighbors milled about, shocked and curious. Police tape and official vehicles blocked off the area, emphasizing the gravity of the situation. Social media platforms accelerated the story's reach. Within hours, images of Gabriel Fernandez had circulated widely as people posted messages of outrage and sorrow. How could this happen became the primary question. Parents, activists, and regular citizens alike targeted their anger at the child protection system, demanding accountability. As more details emerged that Gabriel's case had been reported before, public fury only grew more intense. Television channels provided extensive coverage, inserting the tragedy into primetime news segments. Gabriel's face appeared on screens across the country, accompanied by the anchor's solemn voices reading from official reports. Statements poured in from prosecutors, police, and child welfare agencies. None could hide the glaring truth. The system had utterly failed this boy. With each revelation, repeated instances of abuse, multiple missed opportunities for intervention, the word horror echoed through media reports. The local community responded with a remarkable public demonstration. Residents lit candles and brought flowers to the front of the apartment complex to honor Gabriel's memory. Some stood in silence, holding back tears, while others voiced their anger at the authorities for not stepping in sooner. Television crews captured these emotional vigils, displaying them on national broadcasts. Gabriel's name soon turned into an emblem of the call for justice and reform in child protection. As official documents and statements leaked to the press, each gruesome detail, autopsy records, witness testimonies, suspect interrogations, heightened the public's outrage. No longer seen as a single domestic incident, the tragedy of Gabriel Fernandez was viewed as evidence of repeated institutional failures. Before long, #Gabriel Fernandez was trending worldwide on social media. Parents in far-flung places shared stories of their own experiences with flawed child welfare systems, fueling a collective sense of indignation. Indeed, referring to Gabriel as a legend might usually suggest a reference to a famous hero or figure. Yet in this context, the term reflects how he came to symbolize a greater cause. His story became a rallying cry for activists, civil rights organizations, and everyday citizens who demanded reform in how society protects its children. His life and death were a stark reminder that children are the most vulnerable among us, and any failing in their protection is a failing of society at large. In the days after his death, national attention centered on whether state and local agencies would take responsibility and initiate reforms to avert such tragedies in the future. Calls for policy changes echoed at protests, as people marched with signs bearing Gabriel's face. Though it was too late to save him, an urgent question remained. Would this tragedy serve as the catalyst for genuine change? Meanwhile, the media fervently covered every new development. From nightly news bulletins to in-depth documentaries, details of the case were scrutinized and rehashed. But beyond the headlines, one cold truth rang out. Nothing could bring Gabriel back. All that remained was to hope that his story would stir action and ensure that no other child would endure such cruelty. Through countless news stories, tributes, and legislative proposals, Gabriel's memory lived on, as a symbol of heartbreak and a plea for collective vigilance. So, what was the truth? Was it merely coincidence or part of a greater scheme? After Gabriel Fernandez's death, the investigation and judicial process continued at full tilt. The American public was incensed upon learning of the systemic negligence that allowed such extreme violence to persist. Officials struggled to explain how repeated warnings and complaints, raised by teachers, social services, and concerned neighbors, had failed to protect the child. As the net of the inquiry expanded, not only the individuals responsible for the abuse, but also the system that had overlooked the warning signs were placed under scrutiny. What then was the truth? The term itself seemed tangled and multifaceted. Autopsy reports and statements by doctors and lawyers suggested a protracted pattern of abuse, not a singular, isolated attack. Consequently, the public debated whether this was just a terrible accident or something more pervasive. Some conspiracy theorists speculated on possible motivations behind Gabriel's maltreatment. Yet from every angle, the sum of multiple oversights and complacency painted a picture of institutional failure. Public outrage rapidly transformed into political pressure. People demanded to know, why didn't child protection agencies do their job? Why did social service workers and law enforcement not collaborate to help the boy? Over time, additional evidence emerged. Gabriel had gone to school with visible injuries on multiple occasions. Even so, official action was consistently delayed or insufficient. This convinced much of the public that the situation was no mere coincidence, but the result of systematic breakdowns. While those charged with Gabriel's death faced severe sentences, the boy's story had already transcended a typical domestic violence case, evolving into a national conversation. Throughout the trials, courtrooms reverberated with harrowing accounts of abuse that underscored the gravity of the child's suffering. In the wake of these proceedings, many asked, will justice suffice when Gabriel is gone? The heartbreak lingered, and the sense that the system itself needed a complete overhaul grew stronger. As is common in such high-profile cases, the tragedy birthed a variety of conspiracy theories. Some speculated about clandestine state agendas. Others argued that a disturbed individual's hatred and violence had simply gone unchecked. No matter the viewpoint, the end result remained devastatingly clear. Children in supposedly developed societies can still fall through glaring gaps in protection. And no explanation, be it a conspiracy or human error, would undo what had been done to Gabriel. Official records and investigation results, which eventually became public, clarified many details regarding the sequence of events. They also illuminated disturbing failures to coordinate among social service agencies, law enforcement, and educational institutions. But the public continued to ask, why didn't they hear his cries earlier? Why, when they did hear them, didn't anyone act decisively? None of the people responsible, teachers, neighbors, social workers, could fully alleviate the collective guilt or heartbreak. The loss of an 8-year-old boy to unimaginable violence remained an open wound. In the aftermath, the incident triggered debates on reworking social welfare protocols, reinforcing legal measures to protect children, and ensuring more thorough investigation of any suspicions of child abuse. However, as some policies evolved, Gabriel would never see those changes. He became a posthumous symbol of the urgent need for vigilance. His short life, overshadowed by pain, turned into an emblem that mobilized communities, officials, and activists to strive for a safer system. And so, we come to the final moment, one that raises a lingering question: what happens now? Gabriel Fernandez's name was etched into the annals of child welfare reform, but the tragedy underlined a universal responsibility that no child should be left alone in the face of maltreatment. While reforms and legal amendments may help prevent future tragedies, they cannot erase the past. The voiceover thus concludes, in the end, are there still unanswered questions? Was this merely an accident or part of a deeper failure? Regardless of the theories, Gabriel Fernandez's last 24 hours left an indelible mark on our collective conscience. Sometimes it takes the loss of an innocent life to awaken us all. Perhaps Gabriel's lasting legacy is just that, a silent hero in a story that should never be repeated.